guess that's what was popular.
I mean,
Any
right.
tips or anything?
That's right, because I had had You're right, it's more like 15. That's right. Yeah.
Well, actually,
I think you were in California, a bunch of people were
Mix it up a little bit.
and she's not comprehending. And she ducked behind me. And then we're all stood up and getting ready to go. Mommy's she's older than dad.
get that way.
And everybody just
With that emphasis the kids have.
I mean, really, it was, and I was not 4 years ago. I mean, the scandal's done. Yeah, right. Keep that on the desk, if you will. I'll be your note taker. Yeah, I know, that's not
There's plenty of seats in the front row.
Yeah.
On the eastern fringe of town. Makes sense if it was a county facility, actually,
Hey, Tim. So, Rick? Bob. Good, Jaron? Jerry?
That's exactly what Gabriel said.
those areas are gonna need remediation too, or are they gonna just put affordable housing there? So we just play on top of a toxic waste dump. We don't live there.
For the people who are filtering in, we saved the front row for you. much for coming. Welcome to a community conversation about the Lawrence City budget, hosted by the Coalition for Collaborative Governance. I'm Holly Krebs, our lead organizer, and I thank you very much for coming tonight. The Coalition for Collaborative Governance is a group of actively involved, nonpartisan Lawrence and Douglas County residents who envision collaborative governance that empowers all community stakeholders to shape local policies, budgets, and outcomes. We are advocating for improved transparency, community engagement, and accountability from the governmental entities serving Lawrence, Kansas. We really want consistent integrity and collaboration in our local government. So why are we here tonight? We are here because our city's budget has doubled in the last 5 years, and because the city is expecting a $6.6 million budget deficit next year. We are also here because our coalition believes in community participation in city's decision-making, and we did not find that the city's budget engagement process met their commitment to practice collaborative engagement with our community and to provide transparent access to data. In February, the city offered an online tool for residents to, quote, express their priorities for the budget. This online tool had significant limitations. Participants could only submit input by making 49 funding decisions to solve a complicated puzzle in order to eliminate the deficit, and there was no other way to express your priorities. This online tool also only addressed 24% of the city's budget, which is the general operating budget, which is where they also anticipate their deficit next year. It did not address 45% of their budget that includes capital expenses and debt payments. So what is the purpose of tonight's conversation? Our coalition is hosting this event to provide more transparency about the city's budget and to provide our community a better opportunity to express our budget priorities. Tonight, we can come together to better understand the city's financial situation, to share our priorities and our concerns with each other, and to compile our community's feedback and share it with city staff and elected officials to inform their budget deliberations this year and hopefully for the future. We also aim to model the transparency and community engagement we would like the city to provide for our community in the future. So the first half of tonight's event will focus on educating us about what is the current situation and why. This will include a budget education presentation by me, a video about the city's capital investments from Rochelle Matthews, who is the city's finance director, and then questions and answers with myself and with Kristine Polian, who is a municipal finance expert who has been assisting our coalition with our research. The second half of the night will include small group discussions, and they are an opportunity to gather your feedback about the questions, why is this important, and what should our community do next? And then we'll wrap up and have a survey. We only have 2 hours to examine a very complex issue, so we have tried to plan an efficient evening that will inform everyone and give us an opportunity for substantive discussions. Before we start our budget presentation, I'd like to say just a few words about our coalition's philosophy. Our current political world feeds off of divisiveness, which separates people and creates contention in our communities. Divisiveness does not foster consideration for others, and it does not encourage the creation of collaborative solutions. Our coalition is interested in building more collaborative relationships within our community so we can build solutions that more of us embrace. We believe collaboration is most possible when we genuinely respect others' perspectives and opinions, even when they're different from our own, and when we engage with each other to find our common values and interests. So I ask that we enter into tonight's conversation with kindness and curiosity to find our commonalities and to develop deeper respect for our differences. May this conversation, and more in the future, reduce contention and move us toward more collaborative and productive solutions to our community's challenges. With this in mind, I'd like to set the stage with our ground rules for civil and productive conversations. I'd like to say thank you to Sarah Taliaferro, who helped us come up with these as guidelines to help us lead our discussions so that they can be productive. So first, we ask that you be respectful, thoughtful, and kind toward one another. No violence, aggression, discrimination, cursing, or bullying. We ask that you affirm others' perspectives, and when you disagree, do so respectfully. Please refrain from personal or judgmental comments. Please provide your perspectives in I statements, and don't attempt to speak for an entire group. Finally, people will be given 1 minute of uninterrupted time to speak during the questions and answers and during portions of the small group discussions. During open discussion times, please share speaking time with others. Thank you so much for joining us. Please sit back and make yourself comfortable. We look forward to spending the evening with you. And now let's dive into the city budget. Before we start, I would like to make it very clear that I am not a financial expert. I am a manual therapist who runs a health club. But I am a good researcher, and I'm dedicated to our community. And so I've spent the last 3 months, 4 months maybe, with the help of our coalition's budget analysis team, going through many documents to try and understand our city's budget. It has been challenging. And so what we have tried to do tonight is to distill a very complex, less than transparent amount of information to our community so that we can better understand the situation at hand. So let's first look at our city's total budget changes. The Lawrence City budget has almost doubled in the last 5 years, as you can see from this chart. This chart goes back to 2018, so you can see that during those years it's increased even greater. Most of the numbers that I offer tonight, we try to use 2020 as a benchmark for increases, because obviously that was an important year for our entire nation, and that lots of things changed in the world at that point in time, but we can also see how there were trends that were accentuated in our own city as well. So in 2020, our city budget was $261 million, and this year it's $519 million, almost exactly double. Before we go further, I also want to mention that this portion of our presentation includes lots of numbers. If you want to track these numbers, you can check out the information sheet we've provided tonight to those of you who are in the room. And for those of you who are watching online, these are available at our website at www.c4cgovernance.com. If you're not a numbers person, the graphics we share will illustrate the general trends. And I apologize, I have to occasionally look at my notes because my computer isn't showing me all of my notes. All right. So first, let's recognize how inflation has contributed to the city's budget changes. Prices have increased considerably for the whole nation, rising 22% between January of 2020 and December of 2024. So for all of the numbers that we look at tonight, I'd like us to keep in mind that there's about a 22% increase from 2020 to the beginning of 2025. But significantly, all of the city's expenses have increased well beyond this 22% increase in inflation. So first of all, what is the city spending money on? The city has 4 major categories of expenses. Operations and personnel are the 2 expense categories that keep the city running day to day. This is where our city's $6.6 million deficit is. On this chart, the blue and the orange represent the personnel and operating expenses. The capital expenses are investments in big one-time projects, and these are mostly funded by debt. Those are the darker black color. And then we also have debt payments, and debt payments pay down debt from previous capital expenses. So let's look at the 5-year increases in each of these categories to see what is driving the changes in our city's budget. So as we saw earlier, the total budget has doubled. It's increased by 100% in the last 5 years, for an average of a 20% increase each year. The largest increase has been in capital expenses, which have increased 4.5 times in the last 5 years. Most of these expenses have been financed with debt, which means that the city's debt payments have also increased by about $60 million per year. And our city's debt itself is 1.5 times as much as it was in 2020. Again, these numbers are all in the handout that you have, as I recognize that these are lots of numbers to hold in your mind. Operating expenses have increased by an average of 10% a year, and personnel expenses have increased by 7% per year. Remember that inflation is responsible for about 4% of these annual increases. I'll just make a note here that the personnel expenses we figured from 2019 because 2020 has an unusual spike that comes back down, and so it was an outlier and didn't give us a good comparison. So we're going to look at a few of each of these categories more specifically. So the largest increases in the city budget have come from their capital expenses. These are investments in things that cost over $100,000 and have a lifespan of more than 2 years. The city pays for some of these expenses with cash, but the majority of these expenses are paid for with new debt that the city takes on. Before 2 years ago, our city paid under $33 million per year in capital expenses, and it was actually substantially less for many years. As you can see, 2021 we only paid $7.7 million. Back in 2018 we were only spending $11 million. But starting last year, they started spending well over $100 million per year. $125 million last year, and $152 million in 2025. Next year, documents from last year say they are planning on taking out another $124 million in debt in 2026. And in an email exchange I had with Commissioner Finkeldine, he put that number even higher. And we will look at capital expenses more in our presentation in a little bit. These increases in capital expenses have caused significant changes in our city's debt and their debt payments. The city's total debt is now $463 million, which is 19% increase just since last year. For the last 2 years, their debt payments have been about $20 million a year more than their previous highs. And their new debt will continue to increase their total debt and their yearly debt payments. Finding the city's total debt was one of our hardest research challenges. One of our coalition's goals is increased transparency from the city, and this debt data is a good example of the lack of transparency we faced in our research. We asked the city on several occasions for information about their most up-to-date debt numbers and how their new debt would affect future debt payments. We never got an answer to the second question, and we received a belated answer to our first question about total debt that was a year out of date, even though we asked for that information to date. And that was significant because their debt had increased 19% from the previous year. Our coalition has had the good fortune to work with Kristine Polian, who is here, who is a municipal finance expert and who has volunteered hours of her time to help us research some non-transparent aspects of the city budget. In less than 24 hours, Kristine sent us the documents demonstrating the city's current debt. Now, let's look at operating and personnel expenses, which is where our city's deficit lies. Operating expenses have increased 50% in the last 5 years, or an average of 10% per year. And these with the personnel expenses support these important departments in our community. The Fire and Medical Department, Homeless Solutions, Municipal Services and Operations, Parks and Recreation, Planning and Development, Police, as well as some smaller departments such as our city attorney and city clerk. The Homeless Solutions Program is the newest addition to our city's department, and it is a substantial addition to our city's operating and personnel expenses. The city used federal COVID money to start this program, but a sustained replacement funding source was not identified at the time. This program's cost this year is $4.7 million. So now we're going to look at changes in personnel expenses. Personnel costs for the city have increased 41%, or about 7% annually for the last 6 years. As I mentioned, for most expenses, I've provided comparisons since 2020, but from the chart, you can see that 2020 personnel costs were anomalous, and we had a sudden spike and then a dip back down. So we've used 2019 as our benchmark for these expenses. There are several significant reasons for these increases in personnel costs. These include the city has added almost 150 full-time equivalent employees just in the last 5 years, which is a 17% increase in staffing. At the beginning of this year, they had 999 employees, and with benefits, they pay an average of $109,000 per full-time employee. For reference, our city's median income is about $60,000. The next one is implementing market rate pay. In 2019, consultants conducted a salary study that found that the city was paying their employees below market rate pay. So between 2020 and 2023, the city increased many city staff salaries to bring them up to market rate. At the same time, they implemented automatic, rather than performance-based, annual wage increases for all employees. The city is committed to continuing market rate pay for their employees, as they've been considering what to change in their budget in order to address their deficit. All of the city commissioners expressed support for maintaining market rate pay. But our research indicates that on average, Lawrence may be paying their employees over market rate pay. We assess this was a difficult number to figure out. So we assess this by comparing the number of city employees making over $100,000 per year with the other major cities in Kansas. Because these cities vary in size, we compared the number of city employees making more than $100,000 in relation to every 10,000 residents. So Lawrence has almost 23 city employees who are paid $100,000 or more for every 10,000 residents. That's the red number in the first column. This is, I should have brought my pointer. This is 27% more than the total Johnson County communities, 55% more than Wichita, 65% more than Topeka, and double what Manhattan pays. So our assessment, our suspicion, is that the city has maybe overshot on market rate pay and that there would be a reason to reevaluate their current pay structure. For reference, also, the city's highest paid employee is the city manager, who makes $262,000 as of 2024. All right, so here's the summary slide that we saw before, looking at the increases in different categories of city expenses. And now that you have some orientation, you can see, once again, that the total budget has doubled. Capital expenditures are where we've seen the greatest increase in our budget. Our debt payments have also increased substantially. Our debt is 1.5 times what it was 5 years ago. And our operating expenses have increased an average of 10% and personnel an average of 7%. So hopefully it's helpful to return back to that summary slide after I've plowed through a lot of numbers. So how does the city pay for all of this? The city has traditionally brought money in through 3 avenues: property taxes, sales taxes, and utility fees. That's what you pay for your water, sewer, stormwater, and trash services. But in the last 2 years, debt finance revenue has become another major source of revenue for the city. So, for 2025, the city expects to bring $50 million in property taxes, $56 million in sales tax, $101 million in utility fees, and $139 million in revenue from taking on new debt. The city has other sources of revenue too, but these are the major ones. Here is the city's chart that shows their 2025 revenues. So taxes is the darker color. That includes both property taxes and sales tax. Charges for services include the utility fees and other services like parks and recreation. But then there's this last category that's bigger than taxes that's called miscellaneous. And this demonstrates a second transparency challenge our research team has faced. The city labels 28% of their revenues as miscellaneous here, and there are many places throughout their budget book where they also reference miscellaneous sources, and they don't reference what those sources are. Through our research, we discovered that 93% of this category is revenue brought in by taking out more debt. But the description in the city's budget book for this category lists 6 small sources of revenue and doesn't mention debt at all, even though it's 93% of this category. This chart from 2020, our comparison year, shows the same category, more appropriately labeled as other financing sources, as only making up 6% of the city's revenue. It's the purple sliver. So now let's look at how these funds are distributed. The city's general operating fund, which is the one that's facing a major deficit for next year, receives $34 million from property taxes this year, $41 million from sales taxes, and $6 million from utility fees. Remember that there are other smaller revenue sources too, but we're just going to focus on the major ones. Kristine Polian, the municipal finance expert I mentioned earlier, said that if a city's utility services generate more revenues than needed for their operations, it's not unusual for a larger amount of utility fees to support this general operating fund. I offer that because as we have our discussions later, we're going to be talking about solutions, and it's nice to know what some options are that I, as a not municipal finance expert, wouldn't know was even an option. All right, because the city's biggest increase in expenses is from their capital investments, we're going to look at how those are funded. The city pays for some of their capital investments directly with cash. This money comes from our sales tax, $7 million, and from our utility fees, $4 million. I will also say that it's unclear if the utilities are paying more than that directly because their book is difficult to read. So there's one place where they say that they're transferring money to pay for capital expenses, and then there are other places where they say that the money is allotted for these capital expenses, and so it's not clear if those are two separate revenue sources or if they're the same. And then the biggest question we've had is how is the city paying for this debt? So some of it is paid for with our property taxes. So that's the $13 million. Our sales tax do not go to debt payments, but our utility fees fund a lot of our debt payments. The debt payments for capital expenses that are related to our utilities. So if our water treatment plant needs to be improved, then the utility fees would pay for that debt. Whereas if we were fixing our roads, that would be paid for with our property tax money, if that makes sense. Oh, let me go back. But the rest of how we're paying for our debt is unclear. Again, this is one of the biggest transparency issues that we faced, is that it's not clear where the rest of the money is coming from to pay off their old debt. In the fund that pays off debt, there is one column called miscellaneous again, that we believe is, that the city has told us is revenue from new debt. So we believe that they've spent $14 million taking out new debt to pay for old debt. They also have another line that's called transfer in. And there's a transfer of $33 million into the fund that pays for debt. This comes from another fund, but it's not clear where that money's fund comes from. And this transfer of $33 million isn't recorded in their state budget form, so we can't answer the question of how they are paying for their debt as accurately as we would like to. All right, so the last bit, how has the city paid for these increases? Property tax valuation has increased 40% since 2020, but the city has not changed the property tax rate. So, effectively, the city has absorbed this increased revenue and applied it to increased expenses. Normally, property tax valuation increases at the same rate as inflation, so the increase that you get from property tax revenue is offset by the increase in costs. If you'll remember, we've had a 22% increase in inflation since 2020, but we've had a 40% increase in property valuation. So the city has received more money than offsets inflation. You can also see that utility fees have increased 8% in 2024. They've increased again 10% in 2025, and they're expected to increase again by a comparable percentage in 2026. And then finally, the sales tax revenue naturally follows more of the inflation rates and has increased about 2 to 3% per year for the last decade, except for 2021 and 2022, which were anomalous because of COVID. And now we're going to provide some information from the city. So the city has responded very well to our coalition's request for more information about their capital investments. They created educational materials about their capital improvement plan, including a guide, frequently asked questions, and a video, which we're going to watch next. They also produced the MSO campus handout, which many of you in the audience have. We might not have had enough for everyone. And so we appreciate the city's willingness to work with us to improve educational materials that are available for our community to understand their budget. And so what we're going to do next is watch a video produced by the city's very own finance director, Rochelle Matthews.
The city of Lawrence is evolving, and so are the demands on our infrastructure. That's where the Capital Improvement Plan, or CIP, comes in. The CIP is a long-term planning tool that identifies the city's major capital needs and prioritizes them based on the citywide strategic plan. It helps us look beyond year-to-year budgeting to determine what, when, where, and how public improvements should take place over the next 5 years. This is a separate process from the city's annual operating budget. The CIP looks at every available funding source, including property tax, sales tax, utility fees for water, wastewater, stormwater, and sewer services to help maximize public benefit and link future improvements with financial resources. In fact, the city has been developing and refining its utility rate models over the past several years in anticipation of these infrastructure needs, preparing today to meet the demands of tomorrow. To be included in the CIP, a project must cost at least $100,000 and result in either the creation of a new asset or the enhancement of an existing one. CIP projects are also expected to improve service quality, reduce the long-term cost of ownership, or upgrade critical infrastructure components. The city uses two main financing methods for these projects: debt financing and cash financing. Debt financing means the city issues bonds, such as general obligation or revenue bonds, and pays them back over time with interest. Cash financing uses available funds for reserves to pay for the projects up front. Both types of projects are included in the CIP. Cash finance projects and the annual debt service costs appear in the operating budget in the appropriate fund. When our city manager started in Lawrence, he made it clear that our community had long been underinvesting in its infrastructure. Since then, we've taken a systematic approach to getting back on track. We've invested in cutting-edge assessments like LiDAR, video inspections, and detailed mapping to develop long-range plans that address infrastructure problems before they become crises. We've also focused on achieving the lowest cost of ownership, building smarter now to reduce future maintenance costs and extend the life of our investments. Major projects recently completed or currently underway through the CIP include full corridor rebuilds of 23rd Street, 6th Street, Iowa Street, and Wakarusa Drive, as well as Jayhawk watershed improvements and the construction of the MSO campus. The capital improvement plan represents a smarter, more responsible approach to building the future of Lawrence. Through careful planning, long-term thinking, and strategic investment, we're ensuring that our community foundation is stronger, more sustainable, and ready for what comes next.
So now we're going to move into the questions and answer portion of our evening. And first, I'd like to introduce Kristine Polian, the municipal finance expert I have mentioned, who has been assisting our budget research team because she's going to join me to help me answer the questions that I, not a financial expert, who did not know how to answer. Kristine has served in city governments for 25 years, including serving as the finance director in League City, Texas, and interim city administrator for Valley Center, Kansas. Most recently, she was the chief financial officer for the Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority. And for full transparency, Kristine is also running for city commission, which she decided to do after she started advising our budget research team. We felt very fortunate to have her bring her expert knowledge to our work. And so we'd like to open the floor for questions. People will be given 1 minute to state their question, and we ask that you hold your opinions for our small group discussions later. Thank you. I have a microphone here, and if I could get maybe one of our volunteers would be willing to be the, thank you, sir. If you'd be willing to be the microphone person. I think it's going to take just a moment to warm up. But who would like, I just gave you a whole bunch of numbers. That was, can I just tell you, that was 4 months of my research right there.
Thank you. My name is John Brewer. My question has to do with the capital improvement of our streets around here. As I have discussed this with some of my friends who have been around town for a while, they said, well, we have a deferred maintenance problem. The past commission should have spent money earlier, and now we're having to pay for their mistake. Tell me if that's a helpful observation or if it's even valid.
Would you like to speak to deferred maintenance and the national level? Sure. Infrastructure maintenance is one of the 4 major capital improvement plan categories that we've identified.
I will tell you, hi, I'm Kristine. I will tell you, I moved back in 21. I went to school here years ago. You can take a snapshot of a city and identify issues by looking at their roads. You can't see, hopefully if you're just visiting, hopefully you're not needing the police and fire and you can't see what's underground, storm, water, sewer. So when I moved back here at 21, I was astounded without even looking at a budget because I know the type of revenue that the city's getting just from the University of Kansas and sales tax, right? So when I started doing a deep dive and trying to, I didn't draw the short stick to go for the city commission thing, but I feel like I did almost because I started doing research. When I was trying to assess what was actually going on, how did we get here? How is our property tax and our sales tax going up at the same time, which is not normal? How are our roads so bad? How are people getting priced out of their homes, etc.? And capital infrastructure is one of the issues that we've identified has been grossly neglected. The unfortunate issue here is the folks here today at the elected level and the staff level aren't responsible for that. They're cleaning it up, but I don't know that we can defer anymore. We cannot, so when I look at it, if I were to advise as a city manager or finance director, I would have to tell the electeds, we cannot spend any more money on wants. We have got to ensure that our infrastructure is in place. It has been grossly neglected because here is the ideal CIP that you want, right? So,
And just, CIP means capital improvement plan.
sorry guys, sorry,
Right.
please. I've done it for so long, I forget. When you're doing a capital improvement program, what you want to do is we tax through mills. If you guys are familiar with mills. So what you want is a consistent mill levy for your bond and interest fund, which is how you pay your general obligation debt, i.e. not your utilities. Your utilities are businesses. So you want to tax at a constant mill And so you have X amount of dollars at this mill levy. And then as debt drops off, you build back in, and you are constantly doing infrastructure improvements without disrupting your mill levy, right? That is best practice. To go from approximately $30 million for a CIP program, issue debt, $30 million, 1 year and jump it to 100 is all the evidence you need to know that you neglected your infrastructure. That's it. So yes, that is a brilliant observation. It is an accurate one. So,
And as Christine has pointed out, this is not unusual to Lawrence, that there is a national crisis in infrastructure maintenance and deferred maintenance.
I'm Barry Shalinsky. I am told that we have a city strategic plan or strategic vision, and that is supposed to be what guides budget decisions. One of these strategic goals is strong, welcoming neighborhoods. As near as I can tell, the only expenditure in the budget, or the biggest one certainly, in support of that strategic goal is the planning and development staff, which may or may not actually act in furtherance of that goal. That's something that people can discuss and debate. I'm wondering, are there any other significant things that are in the budget in support of that strategic goal that you've been able to identify? Thank you.
I'm going to think about that for a moment. I would say that a first one might actually be the infrastructure maintenance. So if we look at these categories here, that these are the major capital improvement projects that the city is investing in currently. We'll talk more about the municipal services and operations campus at some point. The wastewater treatment plant is an unfunded mandate from the federal government that is requiring that the city spends about $75 million to update our wastewater treatment plant. But then these last two speak to Barry's question, right? There's infrastructure maintenance, where we invest money in the infrastructure that already exists in the city and brings it up to modern standards. And then there's infrastructure development, which is where we're building new infrastructure in order to expand services to new land that can be developed in the future. And so to Barry's question, I would say that infrastructure maintenance is maybe the best place that we can look in our, at least the capital expenses especially, that are supposed to be supporting neighborhoods. They're supposed to be supporting the existing infrastructure of the city. And Christine, I don't know if you want to say anything about the state of the underground infrastructure that you have discovered and the need for some of this, not just at a surface road level.
well, I mean, I can certainly tell a story. When I was the CFO for the Housing Authority, many of you are aware of the 32 additional units going up at Clinton in Iowa approximately for senior housing. That is one big goal for the Housing Authority, is to let seniors age in place. About 2.5, I'm going to approximate dates, about 2.5 years ago, we went through the rezoning process, which at that time you present what is essentially a site plan, right? And we had identified, and I'll preface this by saying CEO Shannon Oury worked through the issue internally, so I don't even know if the city manager knows, truthfully. But 2.5 years ago, we presented a site plan, and that's where you talk about where your hydrants are going to go, you know, all the things. For those of you that are developers, you're certainly familiar. we got it passed. We went through every department head. This is a standard procedure that every city goes through. Then we go, and when you're dealing with federal dollars, there's a lot more fun involved. So 2.5 years later, to about, I'll approximate August, September of 24, we actually, we're ready. We have gone through the litany of issues that the feds put us through. And we're shovel ready. Now we're gonna pull permits. So now we actually do present a site plan. And it is kicked back that they said, we need you to build a 900-foot service line because the current main along Clinton is so deficient that it's not even supporting what you have today. And we're like, so of course affordable housing, right? That's out of everyone's mouth. We need affordable housing. This gets kicked back at the last minute, which I have heard through my research happens a lot. So what we ended up, I actually wasn't involved in the process at the time, but I caught wind and I said, what? Because you don't do that. You certainly don't do that when there's someone shovel ready. And a partner who's helping provide affordable housing, right? Like all the things are there. So because of my tenure in the state of Kansas, I've been heavily involved in just about every association. I called some folks who knew, and they said, yeah, that main is shot, and it's not set to be repaired for 2 to 3 years. So this was going to add $150,000, $200,000 to the price, which we didn't have, right? So they ended up granting from the housing trust. They gave us a grant for that service line. So that's how that ended up happening. So I was told that by MSO, the powers that be at MSO, and by the way, they're very brilliant. They are great at what they do. But I said, how do you feel the infrastructure is? And she said, I think water and sewer is good. And this is after the fact. This was, and I didn't say a word, but I said to myself and to Holly later, I don't trust it. I did see some I&I trucks in situ form, basically, if anyone knows what that is. You're shooting cameras through your lines to see how things work. I did see some over there in North Lawrence. I do think they are assessing what's going on with infrastructure, but they talk about infill, which of course we want infill, because it's less expensive if you're tapping into existing infrastructure. But how do we know how that infrastructure is? And I don't know that I have a lot of confidence in it, so that's my spiel.
So Barry, to a certain extent, that just speaks to the idea that we need more focus on maintaining what we already have so that our communities and our neighborhoods can have the services that they need to. And what I will say also is that we did not dive into many details into the operating budget, and so I don't know that I can give you more information about some of those other departmental budgets.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Max Couch. I wanted to follow up on the first question that was asked, had to do with the large-scale nature of the capital expenses, and so I just want to flesh this out. It looks like a big number, 445%, right? I mean, it is a big number. But then the response there was, well, we have no choice because we deferred for so long. So my question is in light of the fact that there was so much deference about infrastructure, is 445%? I mean, what were the options that the city would have had? How could they have solved the deficit issue that had been raised without, incurring all of this new debt. Because I think it's hard to hold their feet to the fire, if there was not, and believe me, I love Old City feet to the fire, trust me. but I mean, it's hard to do that, right? If there was all this maintenance that wasn't done, and then this is what they did to solve it.
Right, so we have to look into the nuances, right? So obviously the city is making some really wise decisions some places, and possibly not making some wise decisions other places because we're $6.5 million in the hole. So when we look at the capital improvements, as I said, these are some of the categories that they are investing in. And the Municipal Services and Operations Campus is $130 million in and of itself. And so, as I said, you have a handout that the city made for us about the MSO campus. And they are doing this to replace outdated flood-prone facilities. They're trying to consolidate their services. But one of our coalition's complaints is that there is not transparent cost-benefit analysis of some of the decisions that they are making. In the city's budget book, there is a section that says capital improvement projects impact on operating budget. Do you know how they register it? They tell you if it's increasing the operating budget, not affecting the operating budget, or decreasing the operating budget. They don't provide any numbers. And then when you go into the capital improvement, like the actual projects, they will have a section that will say fiscal impact. You have to dive deep in order to find these documents, right? And at the very bottom in small print, it will tell you what they might save or how much it might cost. But when we met with the Municipal Services and Operations Director asking about this $130 million campus, I said, well, I've seen on the forms that it says that it will save us about $2 million a year. And she said, which means that it would take 65 years to pay back. Right? And she said that that wasn't an accurate analysis, that they had made that estimate much earlier in the project. They had not revisited that question. And so I would say that one of my complaints is that the city does not appear to be doing cost-benefit analyses. And we asked the same question to, I think it was the finance director. And she said, well, we leave it up to the department heads. If they put something into the CIP that then blows their departmental budget, then they have to manage that within their department. So we've gotten several answers that doesn't imply to us that they are doing as much financial planning as they could to be assessing the value of the investments that they're making. And can we hold that truth at the same time as holding the truth that we have deferred maintenance, that we have municipal and services operations buildings that are falling apart? One of their complaints is that all of their vehicles, which many of them cost $100,000 or more a piece, are sitting in a floodplain. And Commissioner Finkeldijk told me a story about one of the Johnson County communities losing $60 million worth of vehicles in a flood, right? And so they're trying to avoid that. So, just like every single decision, there are lots of details. They're taking a lot of things into consideration, and it's not clear if they're looking at the picture as broadly as they could. Yeah, other questions? Yeah, Iris.
Actually.
Sorry, John.
And you're next.
Good evening, all. John Martin. Quick question, which kind of ties into what you were just saying. So Tuesday night's city commission meeting, two things came up that were a bit of a slap in the face of the community. The city commissioners decided to remove transparency, another layer of transparency, by removing the YouTube live broadcasting of the general city commission meetings as well as the public comments. And on top of that, there's something a little less readily visible that they decided to re-up the Catalyst program that the city offers. Now, for those of you that don't know, the Catalyst program is where we provide industrial land, the infrastructure, and a 50 to 70% rebate on the taxes for any new developments out there for periods of up to 10 years. They went ahead and renewed that without hardly any discussion, zero financial data, zero cost benefit analysis, zero historical data, just that it was a great program, rubber stamp, in a matter of 5 minutes. So how do we as an organization, and as a wider question, how do we as a community get these folks to learn Finance 101 and start taking our money, spending our money like they would spend their money?
Kristine, would you like to field that? I feel like that's your wheelhouse.
Well, having done it for many, many, many years, there is no doubt disseminating information is very difficult, especially if people want to be spoon-fed, if I may say, right? This town is not like that. This town is very engaged. This would be the fourth city that I've observed, I guess, as I am as a candidate, which we're not talking about tonight.
Could you speak up a bit more?
I'm sorry.
There you go.
How's that? I'm usually very loud. I'm going to tell you the reality is to have the financial expertise that you have, that we'll say that I have, my experience, you cannot get that through a university. The only way you can get the education of governmental accounting is through experience and through training. I've trained city clerks across the state for years for their certification program. You can't, so what I would, one of the things that I would want to do if I were able to have an impact is provide that education. But more importantly, I think our elected officials need to have that information. And it's difficult to train because you guys, it's extensive. It is extensive. And I only know it because I've been doing it for 22 years. How do you do that for somebody that's sitting there for 2 years or 4 years? But here's the reality. It's difficult, but it's not an option to not do it. You have to train your elected officials. I have not been broached by the city as a candidate, which is surprising because I handled, for my organization outside of Wichita, I was the person who took and reviewed all of the candidates' paperwork and then got it over to the county. At that time, you used to be able to submit it to the city. So I knew immediately who my candidates were, and I would reach out to them. League of Kansas Municipalities has a candidate guide. There's a lot of information, but it really needs to start with the city, with the municipality, and you start that training. So we have to demand that the electeds are getting better training. Simple as that. I don't have a better answer, you know? It's just hard to get the information. It's hard to have this knowledge without having done it over and over and over. I've issued debt for hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. You know, you don't, I didn't know what the hell I was doing when I started in this career because it was absolutely crazy. But you got to do it because your electeds can be ruled by your staff if you don't. And that is not how that's supposed to work.
I have a quick public service announcement from one of the budget people on the coalition, and then I've got 3 people queued up, and I'll bring you one.
Unlike the city who doesn't really want your opinion, or at least it seems that way, we do. And there's going to be a survey sent to you. If you would please take the opportunity to fill it out in the next couple of days. That's part of why we want your email. Okay?
Thank you, Tim. I also wanted to just tack on to what Christina said because she's educated me about this, of how difficult it is for the finance specialists in the city to get educated to do their job well. So what that means is that if you have had a history of poor financial planning in a city, like within the city staff, that poor financial planning gets transmitted to the next director and the next director and the next director. And so as we were reviewing things, we would see patterns of behavior that the current finance department is perpetuating from previous years that are not best practices, not because they're not trying, but because they were trained by people who were not using best practices. So just like we talked about, the current city commission is having to make hard decisions about capital investments, that similarly, our current finance department is doing their work on the shoulders of the previous finance experts. And if those experts did not use best practices, then we need our finance community to improve their practices. So, if nothing else, John, we'll do some research and figure out what best practices are. I mean, really, I did a second budget report identifying a whole bunch of transparency issues, and the hope is that all of the research that we're doing that's saying this is not consistent, this is not clear, that's going to be feedback that we hope the finance department takes and improves their process next year and the following year and the following year. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Iris Craver. A few weeks ago, the City Commission took off the agenda a resolution to declare the city a state of emergency and give the police more powers and do away with the regulations and ordinances and protections for vulnerable people in this community. And they said they needed to do that to be in compliance with the Republican administration in Washington, D.C. that is asking our city to comply with their, I guess, their DEI initiatives. And the city commissioners took it off the agenda. They were saying that they had to do this to declare our city an emergency because they were going to lose, it was either $8 or $11 million, I got different numbers, in federal funding. And I would like to know where that $8 or $11 million was supposed to fit in here somehow. And although they took it off the agenda, I don't trust them. So I'd like to know where this all fits with them wanting to declare our city a state of emergency.
So first I will say, from our coalition's perspective, which is separate from the budget issue, is that our coalition submitted a letter to the City Commission asking for lots of detailed information about that specific proposal because we suspect that that resolution will come forward again. And so we asked for very specific information about what federal grants they have out, what they are for, and how much they are for. We asked for information about which specific policies they were suggesting that they suspend, as well as many other questions. So we also believe that that issue will probably come back. One of the questions that we asked is, can the city make changes to those policies without bringing them before the City Commission? Because as a community, I believe that we want that to be an open discussion if they do consider that in. So our coalition is doing some work on that front to try and get as much information as possible. You're welcome. And then to the intergovernmental funds. Intergovernmental funds were accounted for about 5% of the city's budget for 2025. So for 2025, that was about $8.5 million. Much of that goes to transportation and to road work. But it's also scattered in different places. And the city has also submitted a pretty competitive grant proposal for $22 million in ADA sidewalk repairs. The ADA sidewalk compliance is an unfunded mandate. The city is going to have to spend, is it 200 million?
It's 100.
It's 100 million over the course of the next 20 years. So if we got that $22 million grant, it would turbo boost our sidewalk program that we have to do. I think that there are options for being creative, and that's the reason that we have asked for a community discussion so that we can figure out how could we get that money without denying our community's commitment to non-discrimination and civil rights. So thank you, Iris.
Can you describe, Kristine, the financing, how that's working, duration, interest that's paid, stuff like that?
Talking about debt.
How are they financing? Is it like how you've seen in the past?
No. This one, This one I was a little surprised by. So the state of Kansas, first of all, you issue debt, which we should not be afraid of debt, okay? That creates generational equity. What that means is the people today are not bearing the entire burden of infrastructure that will last forever, right? So debt doesn't bother me, but how you issue debt is pretty important. So your GO debt is what is backed by the full faith and credit of the taxpayer dollar, i.e., the city can issue as much debt as they want as long as they're not at their debt capacity and just keep raising taxes, right? So the only thing stopping that is this, right? Now, if we get into some of the specifics of how you issue debt, the state of Kansas legislatively is actually very, very good at allowing municipalities opportunities to get their infrastructure through debt, and not all states allow this, but the state of Kansas allows what's called temporary notes. Have you guys ever heard of them? Okay, so I finally figured out the best analogy, because I have talked about this, I've researched it, I've gone to the professionals to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. So temporary notes are essentially a construction loan. If any of you have built a home, you take out a construction loan. And that allows you to just take care of the construction cost while you're building, and then after it's completed, you go to a permanent financing, a mortgage in our case. City's case, bonding. We issue permanent bonds at that point. But temporary notes are brilliant because the last thing you want to do is issue a 20-year bond before you know what the exact cost of the project is. You have to do it that way in Texas. But Kansas allows us to do temp notes. So you get the temp note, you finish the project, you have to the penny the exact cost, you roll it into 15, 20, 25, depending on the infrastructure and its life, and then you go on your way. So when they were asking the questions and she said I had the information 24 hours later, all of this stuff is out there. I've done bonding for, 20 years. So I went out and I got the bond transcripts. I pulled the bond transcripts just for GO. I didn't pull revenue. And I went back to 2011 and I looked at the official statements that are out there. They're out there. Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board has a site called EMMA. You can go out and get any transcript for any city, for any issuance. So I went and pulled them. And what I noticed as I'm reviewing the official statements is that we are issuing 1-year temporary notes every time.
But you're able to issue.
So the state statute allows you to have a temporary note out for 4 years. So here's the analogy. You're building your home, you know your home's going to take 3 years, 2.5, 3 years to build. You pull a construction loan. After a year, the home's not done yet, you go to another bank, you pull another construction loan, absorb the first one, and go about your way. And you pay closing costs again. And then, through the next year, you do the same thing. You go to another bank, and you absorb those 2 years, and you pay closing costs again. That is what we have been doing. You pay a cost of issuance every single time you issue a temp note. If anyone wants the bond transcripts, I can get them for you or get you to the site.
Are interest rates lower or higher for those?
They're typically, they're lower, actually. They're a little lower. No. So the whole thing about bonds, guys, if you've ever bought munis, is you know it's guaranteed, right? So we hear the stock market, then when you start talking about bonds, those are the things that people pack their portfolio with for stability. So temp notes are going to cost a little more, but what you should be doing, I went and I started researching. Basically, I've issued many temp notes in my career. I have literally never issued a 1-year temporary note, nor has some municipal advisors that I spoke to. What you do in that case, you issue a 3-year temporary note, and you build callable features into it so you can retire that debt sooner. But that's not what we're doing, and I don't know why. So, when we start talking about how things are actually being done, I don't know if anybody would have known better. Certainly not anybody I would expect on the bench. So, there's some of the things that we have uncovered. Does anyone have any questions on that?
We're going to do one more question, and then we're eating into our small group discussion, and I really want to make sure that we take time for that. So let's take one last question.
Well, it was related to the debt burden. You raised an interesting thing about these temporary notes. Is it the same third-party agents and attorneys who work those temporary notes that you notice in the record?
Yes. So in every issuance that you do, you're going to have your bond counsel and you're going to have your municipal advisor. And 2012, 2013, 2014, well, it was a fallout of Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So it was a SOX issue. We could no longer have the municipal advisor be the underwriter, so those two had to separate, right? So essentially, you're going to have a municipal advisor, you're going to have an underwriter, and you're going to have bond counsel. Gilmore and Bell is the leading bond counsel in the state. And they literally process paperwork, if that makes sense. So if we want to question any of the partners in the issuance, I personally would not question G&B because they literally, a city goes to Gilmore and Bell and says, hey, we have this project, we need to think about bonds. The municipal advisor should be the one doing the financial planning, right? I try to find, for example, I was trying to find how CIP is tied to debt, and it just basically lays it out. According to the municipal advisor, the city handles all their financial planning. However, I will say this because I know all the players in Kansas, and I don't want to speak ill of any of them, but I will say this hypothetically, your municipal advisor would know better. And the municipal advisor has been the same for years, previous to 2011.
Just a quick follow-up. As a debt burden, how does this city compare to other municipalities of similar situation? Where are we?
Not bad, because it's debt. You have a debt limit. Every city has a debt limit, which is 33% of your expenditures. Right? Did I say no? Valuation. Excuse me. Valuation. 33% of your valuation. Right? But there's a lot of debt that you issue that doesn't go against your debt capacity. So someone said something about we've got a lot of debt to the finance director. I don't know, was that you? Someone I know. And the finance director said, oh, don't worry, we've got plenty of debt capacity. And I said, that is not, I think I might know 3 cities that got close to their debt capacity and they were in trouble by that time. You do not want to get close to that number.
So the question is our debt sustainable? Can we pay for it? And so to Christine's point, I think that was actually quoted in a newspaper article that Rochelle Matthews said, we're not close to our debt limit, we don't have any concerns about how much debt we're taking out because the state allows, I think it's up to 30%, you think it's 33%. We're at 13%. And so that means we could take out another more than double what we currently have. But if we can't make our debt payments, then that's not sustainable, regardless of whether you have the legal authority to take out that much debt. All right, so with that, we need to move on to our small group discussions. For those of you who have questions that did not get answered, can you please write them on one of the note cards that we are going to have in the small group discussions so that we make sure that we can get answers to you? If you write your name and even your email address, we might be able to connect with you. Or Kristine and I are not going to participate in the discussions and are going to come around for questions if needed. And so we can be there to answer some of those questions at that point in time. All right, so now we're going to move to the second part of our evening. And there's so many things we didn't talk about, guys. We could do this like 3 more nights. Look at all of these slides that we didn't look at. This is the municipal campus outline and all of the bonds that have been voted upon for that project alone. All right, so we're not doing all of this. So we're going to skip forward to, so for those of you, Tim mentioned that we have put together a city budget survey. We found that the city's community engagement process did not allow us to submit any comments. It was a very complicated system. We have hopefully put together a pretty thorough survey. In the survey, which you can either, you can get to through this QR code, you can get to it on our main page, and you have that information in your handouts, that we ask that if you're willing to at least to fill out the first 2 sections of the survey, those are really the budget-oriented questions. The next 2 sections are more where there are open-ended questions to talk about how you feel about the budgeting process, their transparency, their community engagement, and some other questions. So the first 2 sections, I think, include 16 questions, so if you can at least fill those out, we would really appreciate it. I'll put this one back up at the end of the meeting. But now, let's move into small group discussions, and this is your opportunity to share your perspectives and your opinions. So what we're going to do is we're going to get together into small groups, and we're going to have 2 rounds. The first round of discussion is going to be what are your top 1 to 3 concerns you have about the city's current budget situation. And then the second question is, what do you think are the best next steps the city could take to solve these financial decisions? They're going to be a consistent format where you'll have about a minute to write something down on your note card. And then in the group, each person will have a minute to share. And then you'll have an open discussion to figure out what are the common themes in everyone's answers. And we'd like to have one person in each group take some notes about those common themes. And so that's going to be the format for the discussions. So the way we'd like to break into groups is that if you're sitting in this row here, you 5 people plus a facilitator are going to be in a group. People in this row are going to be in a group. So that means that you're not going to be with somebody you came with. It helps us mix it up. We've gotten spots set up around the room, so if you see a group of chairs that's gotten started, you can make your way to that group. Because some of the rows are a little bit slim, we might group a few people together. But let's have this first row come and be at this spot. Second row can be at this spot. Third row, there's a cubby for you in the back. Fourth row, there's the middle cubby. Fifth row, that back cubby. And then let's have this first row here. Second and third row, let's combine you. And then maybe our last couple of rows, we can have you dispersed into groups depending on which ones look like they're a little small. I don't think we need everybody, so if you just want to join another group to work out. I think because
So that's the consequence of I agree, but what I'm arguing, they should be.
You can be, but it's easier.
Right, exactly.
And everybody.
It's actually 39 million dollars
So that's a big, that's a
challenge, right?
So I went Tuesday to the city council.
Right, exactly.
But I said, we deserve it. Every single grant is source and how much they do.
Right, exactly. Right.
So,
Right, exactly. Okay. Yes, no, absolutely, right. Yes, exactly.
The attorney wrote that, he didn't use but he wrote it generic.
Oh, right.
He knew that they were not just, DOT was just the first one off the cuff.
Right, so, but aren't they a lot of, okay, some of them will be that a lot of these are state funds.
Yeah, the state is.
I mean, that's.
They just pass it, they go from, it goes from Arizona. Some of those. And the state
Right.
has a shame.
And so my question is, would the requirement from the feds apply to money that's getting sent out to the state?
The state is not, you see, these are good things. The state's not on.
Right,
I go every single county. It's fully aware of some letters. In fact, they already have some things.
Okay.
They're under the city.
Right, exactly.
Which is just going to interrupt all things.
Very much so. Right.
I think it's bad. As far as my concern, it's bad. They tell us citizens.
That's exactly what we would like to do. And there's no reason that it should, right, like, this should just be transparent.
Because folks, I don't know if you've watched
No, I didn't, but I know that a whole bunch of people showed up anyway.
That's our entire housing.
But we should and so I was just looking at it, there is what is it? There's a federal grant fund, the city, and that was getting really money. And so, right, exactly. And so I'm just wondering that's because they, well, no, I think it's because this is I think that ideally it gets really something that they still have to understand. Oh, right, no, that's totally right. Yes.
And that's what's going on.
Oh, right, exactly.
But
Right, so the
whether
20
it's police or but if it is going on, revenue models.
Right, exactly. Which is the reason that we need to go. Right. Yeah, thank you for going to meeting. So what's your name again? Okay, yes. Have we, well, what exactly, I'm trying to remember if someone told me your name, like I recognize your name. How do you spell it? Yes. Great. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, I have this whole slideshow, and I keep asking if you can send me the link, because that's what I really want to make sure is that I've got the primary sources. Exactly right. If I could get all of this. Yes, exactly. Right. Well, we're looking for collaborative solutions, and they they're not coming to this as like we're all in this together. Oh, I think they originally only asked me to come in and then but then I think that it's something like 1.5 is but the thing is frustrating is and exactly. I read this also in the academic firm that part of it is because they don't do I don't need it. That is also one of our contentions, right? That there's just deference. I think it absolutely happens in the city. There would be more trustworthy staff processes. Okay, well, I agree with your assessment. Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah, exactly. And if we get some answers, because there are questions about resolutions, we're going to get some more information. And the city's, let's see, the city manager's recommended budget comes out that means so. And so I'm thinking
Or did they leave, or did they circle back?
These are exactly the questions that I've had about
Whether the homeless was.
right, exactly. And then you're just throwing money at separate. I think when you were saying about lots of people involved, everybody has their own budget, so you're their own. Are you wondering? Okay, just so that, like, I'd like to look at it so that, you know, on one hand, doing this research is eating up my life for the last 2 months. Yeah, exactly. And I have 3 kids, so, yeah, right, exactly. It'd be easier if that were the case. And so I'm looking at this step by step, intense idea of we're just trying to do transparency with our people. And so if we coordinate with what already is research and then our needs to document it, publicize it, and share it with the community as widely as possible, that my experiences that are doing that kind of thing, wrapping the information back to officials rather than directing all of the information. And so one of my thoughts is that exactly the most visible and transparency we can create over this job community, then the commission is willing to, it's just, it pressurizes the situation and the exactly. And again, right. I think right but it sets up for community input to be Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad that we got a chance to meet, and I'm glad that we did research. Intergovernmental funds, yeah, exactly. Especially for you to find out what the numbers are. Thanks for coming. Such a pleasure. Thank you. You are.
Budget. And they said, what are your qualifications?
If you haven't moved on to round 2, may I suggest that your group wrap up round 1 and move on to our second question? Thank you.
Yeah, that was like,
Discussion.
We didn't get it from the city after we got a budget of $6 million. Because it's a recognition.
And privacy concern about this record.
And so it takes consideration, there's in my opinion,
Well, that's 3 years
with the information that we have. Well, actually, let me first say thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to my coalition budget analysis team, several of whom are here. We have been sharing emails since the beginning of February and have gotten tons of good input from lots of people in our coalition, and I'm very grateful for all of the work that they've done. I'd like to thank the people of the city, Rochelle Matthews, Corey Wallace, Brad Finkeldye, and also Andy Inez at MSO, who made the flyer for us. I'd like to thank Kristine for being our municipal finance expert and consultant. As I said, she has put in many hours to help me understand some things that were really difficult to understand. I'd like to thank Sarah Taliaferro and Noel Razor, who both helped us with the community engagement part of tonight's planning. Connor Austin is our videographer who's done the live streaming, and we'll be making this so that we can post the meeting on YouTube, and as well as splitting it into small little segments so that we'll have little videos about different parts of the budget that we can share, and so we can further this education to the broader community. I would really like to extend my thanks to all of our volunteers and facilitators. We have an amazing coalition. Like this, we just started at our first meeting was like December 30th. And so we're only 5 months in? We're only 5 months in, and we have moved at rapid fire pace because we have so many amazing volunteers working with us. And I am so delighted, and I hope that we can keep making strides in our community. And then thank you to all of you, our community guests, for coming. This type of conversation doesn't happen if we don't have people show up. So thank you very much. So what we're going to do next is that here is the QR code for the Lawrence Budget Survey. Also, if you wanted to support our coalition's efforts, we wouldn't say no to some small donations. We have to pay for renting the room, we have to pay for supplies, we're paying our videographer, and so if anybody wanted to support our efforts, we would love that. But as for the community survey that we have, I mentioned it earlier, that we are going to compile both the information that you guys put together during your small group discussions, as well as the information from the surveys, and we're going to submit that to the city. Anybody who is interested in speaking before the city commission, please let me know. They are having a meeting on June 17th, so just in a week and a half, about their capital improvement plan. I would love to have people who have been informed by our education to go and share their opinions, their perspectives, their concerns about the ways that the city is choosing to invest. And like I said, it is a nuanced issue. There are positives and there are negatives, and all of that is true, and they need to hear some of that from our community. So there's a meeting on June 17th before the city, and then on July 8th, the city manager is proposing his recommended budget for 2026, and so that will be another opportunity for our coalition to present some information from the survey, as well as for people to speak or to submit written comments. So please be involved. Like, continue to be involved, and we really appreciate you coming tonight. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you. Yeah, main thing is
Thank you. I will add you to our list of folks. Perfect. No, Elizabeth was doing it. You're so welcome. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Yes. Even if someone can only take like one question from the survey and extrapolate some data, like from one of those comments, so I might send you an email. And if you're doing it, it's fine. But if they have something to do, we can just get some. Thank you for coming and taking that. Thank you.
Do you have a company?
Myself, yeah.
I'm glad that there was a big turnout. I've done a lot of work trying to get this out. And I think that this is an issue that interests a lot of people, especially in city commission election years. So like we probably had 4 or 5 city commission candidates here. Yeah, exactly. So there's a good number of I don't think we have to take down the trees. We might want to put them back into their.
Oh, okay. Or just leave. Oh, yeah.
Stragglers, maybe if you can rebuild the road.
Okay.
Good. Great. Bye, Tina. I made these Medicare standards. And so I just need to pull them out. Okay. I think this would we can have 2 more conversations like still. Thank you for appreciating it. Yeah. Thank you. We are going to do that's right. I think housing is the next one. Yes, absolutely. Thank I was impressed by how that yeah. Do these chairs stay here? I think the chairs that were set up maybe but maybe we didn't need this table. Thanks. I mean, thank you.
Yeah, right here I use a talking mic which picks up sound some of it. So I got this speaker up there. It's perfect. So even though there's a clarity in my the audio is good. Heavily video sessions. Well, it has to, but
I think that if I just take everything I'm gonna go home with tires. Is there anything? How did you take the camera? Oh, maybe that's cheesy. Okay, we're good on it. I'll bring it in. Thank
this is
So we got
Feels like a real